This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my forthcoming book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. Learn more and pre-order now at christyharrison.com/book. That's christyharrison.com/book. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 200 of Food Psych. I can't believe I'm saying that number. 200 episodes is a big milestone, and we have a great episode for you today to celebrate. So I actually had a different episode scheduled to run for this episode, and then I talked with Jeff Iovannone during Pride Month early in June and realized that we absolutely have to run this episode for Pride because it is so good and because he has such brilliant points to make about how diet culture shows up in the gay community and how to fight back, how the gay community can go about creating its own body liberation movement, and why that's so important. We also talk about harmful body standards in the gay community and the way the wellness diet shows up in this community now, how oppression and the AIDS crisis shaped what Jeff calls the normate gay aesthetic, why every body is a pride body, and so much more. It's a great conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Monica P., who writes, okay, so a few things. First, I absolutely love your podcast. I listen to it several times a day, and I find so much safety and security in it. It feels like the only safe and non-toxic space where I know my thoughts and anger will be validated. I've been struggling with an eating disorder for about 5 years now. It got real bad real fast during my freshman year of college. I got to a place that was considered socially ill very quickly, although I kind of knew it was illness all along. I immediately went to residential treatment for 3 months where I thought I had a life-changing experience. 2.5 years later, though, I continue to struggle. I shift back and forth in levels of care at a well-known treatment center. During my second stay in residential for 6 months, I was super eager and left all my food rules at the door, stepping into the closest thing I've gotten to intuitive eating thus far. I gained a lot of weight very rapidly, going from quote-unquote underweight to quote-unquote overweight. The entire team seemed to be confused and informed me of it too. They looked for causes, not finding answers, and ultimately looked at my food as a possible quote-unquote problem. I can still hear them saying, "So how is the food going? Have you changed it a little?" Unfortunately, this was a bit traumatizing for me. It completely validated the thoughts that I could not trust my body and basically am not allowed to eat intuitively. Since returning home, I relapsed into bulimia as every time I ate past fullness, I felt like I had messed up. I've realized via the Health at Every Size community that the fast weight gain I experienced is totally normal and okay, and that long periods of reactive eating might be necessary, although I was not even binging because I was highly supervised during my stay in treatment. Even though I feel like I've read and come to understand everything up to date about health at every size and body liberation and believe in it wholeheartedly, I think there is some part of me that still thinks I can recover in a way that bypasses the reactive eating, and that this time, because I've lost some weight since the relapse, that I can do it quote unquote right. It worries me how intuitive eating is taught in treatment as always eating mindfully, starting and stopping at certain numbers. I think the perfectionist in me took that very literally. It's a bizarre place to be in because I don't have any thoughts about changing my body, I have no wishes to restrict, and I've healed my relationship with movement. Based on my thoughts, it pretty much makes no sense that I still have an eating disorder, and yet I'm trapped in this cycle of reactive eating that I'm not allowing myself to heal from. I feel so trapped and want to be a part of the community, but I feel like I keep drowning in my own eating disorder and watching the community grow without me. I hear a lot of people on podcasts saying how they recovered when they began to want life more than the eating disorder, or that they did it without treatment. And it sounds so simple. But if recovering takes wanting it, I'm not sure what that looks like because I've never wanted something more in my life. I try to have compassion and patience with myself, but for about 3 years now of consistent treatment, I've watched people come and go while I remain one of the constants at this treatment center. I hate my eating disorder so much and just want it to be a part of my past already. I feel like no one knows how to help me at this point. I hope that you answer this question because it is one of shame and isolation, and I wonder sometimes who else is out there and feels the same way and needs to hear an answer too. So thanks, Monica, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and are not a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So first of all, I just want to send you so much compassion for what you've gone through. It really does sound traumatic and traumatizing, and I don't use that word lightly. And I think what you went through at that treatment center is not okay. You're absolutely not alone in having this experience and going through this. Unfortunately, so many people have similar experiences with eating disorder treatment providers who are still caught up in diet culture, and it's really traumatizing. And actually, for me, when I first started working in the eating disorder treatment field and started going to conferences and trainings about eating disorder treatment and hearing about health at every size and learning that that was a best practice for treating eating disorders, I was shocked and appalled at some of the things I heard people say at treatment centers that I worked at or coordinated care with as an outpatient dietitian. People were saying things like, he should be losing weight if he's not binging, so clearly he's still using behaviors, or ask her if she really needs that evening snack and maybe she can cut back on it. And all of these things were said about people in larger bodies, never about people in smaller bodies. And it really got me thinking that this was a huge problem and a huge disconnect in our field if the best practices and the scientific evidence for treating eating disorders points toward health at every size as the gold standard for treatment, and yet these things are still being said to people in treatment centers. And that was one of the reasons why I started focusing this podcast on the topic of health at every size and started really delving into it in depth. And one of the reasons why I continued covering this content, because I just feel like it's so important for everyone of any profession, but especially people who work in the eating disorder treatment field, to hear about and learn about health at every size and to start to incorporate it into their practice. And also to hear stories from people like you who've really suffered at the hands of fat-phobic treatment providers and eating disorder treatment teams. And so you're absolutely not alone in having this experience. It's super traumatizing to people who go through it. And there was actually a very high-profile case of this happening recently it's actually still ongoing as I record this. So Shira Rose, who is an eating disorder therapist and body positive style blogger, who's also currently struggling herself with an active eating disorder because relapses happen and people who are working in the treatment field themselves sometimes can still relapse. Shira went to a well-known eating disorder treatment center and was basically told the same things that you were told, like, oh, we don't know what's going on with your body, but it's probably about the food. And even though her restrictive thoughts and behaviors had completely taken over her life and she was suffering tremendously from her eating disorder, she was told by this treatment center that she needed to eat less than the other clients because her body was larger. And as you can imagine, that was incredibly damaging to her recovery, and she's still struggling and suffering because of it. There was also a lot of other horrible, unethical things that happened at that treatment center. And if you're interested in reading about it, we'll link to her blog post about this experience in the show notes for this episode, though I just want to give a big trigger warning for that because there are descriptions of disordered eating behaviors and thoughts and disordered things that people said and did in the treatment center as well. So just be very cautious and mindful if you do read this piece, but I think it's just evidence that, people go through this all the time. Even someone who is an eating disorder therapist herself and a health at every size therapist at that, who goes to treatment and tries to recover from a relapse, is told these horribly fat-phobic things and made to do fat-phobic behaviors in treatment. So you're not alone, Monica, who asked the question, and it's really a travesty in the field of eating disorder treatment that needs to be corrected. We need to have size acceptance and fat acceptance be the norm for every treatment provider across the country and around the world. But of course, that's a really hard thing to get to because treatment providers are people too who grew up in diet culture and are steeped in diet culture just like everyone else. And so, Monica, it sounds like you encountered a treatment team or at least some treatment providers at this center who were fat phobic, who were steeped in diet culture, who had their own issues with food and body size and these outdated, inaccurate beliefs about fat bodies. And that's on them. That's not on you. So I just want to say that is, of course, it's incredibly traumatizing, and I can understand why you would internalize those beliefs because these are people who are supposed to be helping you with your recovery. But it's not your fault, and it's very much their fault that they pushed those ideas onto you. And of course, your eating disorder brain was going to seize on this fat phobic belief that you couldn't eat intuitively like everyone else, which I want to just call bullshit on. That is not a valid belief. That's an eating disorder belief. I'm not calling bullshit on you, Monica, who asked the question. I'm calling bullshit on that belief. And to say that you, just as much as everyone else in the world, deserve to eat intuitively, deserve to take care of your body, deserve to eat as much as you want, as much as you need in order to feel secure and satisfied and assured that food is not going to be taken away again. And you've already been through the trauma of food deprivation, and now you're having layered on the trauma of fat phobia, which I'm sure you've experienced in other ways as well, just living in the world in a larger body, but now especially at this treatment center experiencing fat phobia. Of course, that's going to make it so much harder to recover. And of course, that's going to make your recovery take longer. So please don't beat yourself up that this is a long road. So many people out there have very long and winding roads to recovery, so you're not alone. And I think one of the reasons that that's the case, that so many people have these long paths to recovery, is because of diet culture, is because we live in a fat phobic society that is constantly reinforcing eating disorder beliefs at every turn. It's very hard to recover in a culture that constantly praises and holds up eating disorder beliefs and sick bodies, emaciated bodies, as the gold standard. It's incredibly toxic to our mental and physical health to live in a culture like this. And if you're someone who's already suffering with an eating disorder that is entrenched in your mind and taking over your life, it's no wonder that recovery is so elusive. It's no wonder that recovery hasn't happened for you yet. And so I would highly recommend for you, and for anyone who's listening who's in this boat, to find a health at every size treatment center and providers that are fully steeped in health at every size and are not going to put you on a diet while you're trying to recover and are not going to make you engage in quote unquote mindful eating and be hyper fixated on every bite you put in your mouth under the guise of intuitive eating, because that's not really intuitive eating. That's just dieting by another name. That hyper fixation on how much you're eating and rating your hunger and fullness levels on a scale can so easily, as you experienced, get twisted into eating disorder rules, get subsumed into the diet culture and diet mentality beliefs that you're already holding, that the eating disorder is then using to dictate your life, to create rigid rules that you have to follow or else, and to just make your recovery that much more difficult. And so it really is a tall order at this point in time to find a treatment center that is fully pro-health at every size and isn't going to push you back into disorder the way that this one did. But there are a few out there. So I would recommend checking out Opal Food and Body Wisdom in Seattle. It's one of the very few treatment centers I know of that is fully aligned with health at every size principles. And they have intensive outpatient and partial hospitalization levels of care. I don't believe they have residential treatment available at this point, but if you're in the IOP or PHP level of care, it could be a great option. You can find it at opalfoodandbody.com, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. The other option I would recommend checking out is Center for Discovery. They have some health at every size folks in really high up positions at a company. I know that they've been making a real effort to align all of their treatment centers with health at every size principles. So I think it would really be worth looking into them. And especially in the Los Angeles area in California, they have some treatment centers in that area that my friend and former podcast guest, Aaron Flores, is a dietitian for. He's a health at every size and fat positive dietitian who would be, I think, a really safe person for you to work with for anyone in recovery from disordered eating. So those would be my 2 recommendations of treatment centers to look into. And I would love if anyone else listening who is a treatment provider could reach out if they are doing health at every size work at their facility. If they're in, I'm not talking about the outpatient level, but more intensive outpatient or partial hospitalization or residential levels of care. I'd love to get a little head count going of dietitians and therapists and maybe medical doctors too who work at these facilities who are fully committed to the principles of HAES and fat acceptance, and to maybe get a list going of providers to look for at treatment centers specifically. So you can email me to do that. Email my team at admin@christyharrison.com. That's ADMIN at christyharrison.com. And we'll also link to the Opal Food and Body Wisdom website and the Center for Discovery website in the show notes for this episode. So I hope that helps, Monica. I really am sending you so much compassion, and I know what a slog it can be to try to recover from an eating disorder in this culture. So you're absolutely not alone, and you deserve full recovery. You deserve care, the care that you need in order to recover, and you deserve for that care not to be fat phobic and not to be steeped in diet culture. And there is care like that available now. It's few and far between, but I'm hoping that with the release of my book and with the work we're doing here on the podcast, that more and more eating disorder treatment providers are getting the message that health at every size and fat acceptance have to be fully integrated to the work that they do to help their clients recover from eating disorders. So thanks so much for that great question. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my forthcoming book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. The book is a deep dive into the subjects that we're always talking about on this podcast, including the origins of diet culture, how to recognize it in all its sneaky forms, including in eating disorder treatment centers, and how to heal from it by letting go of efforts to lose weight or eat quote unquote perfectly, and instead reconnecting with the innate wisdom about food and movement that we're all born with, aka intuitive eating. I'm so psyched by the responses to the book already, I have to say. On the day that I announced it was available for pre-order, it was the #1 bestseller of all books in the eating disorder self-help category on Amazon, and it's still the #1 new release in that category. And not only does that make me feel so good to see that response to the book, but it also helps you and your ability to heal from diet culture. Because when the book gets on these bestseller lists, it reaches more people. And when it reaches more people, we get more allies in the anti-diet movement who can help us stand strong against diet culture and help us push back the tide of disordered eating. We get more people on our side who can help us change the world. So thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone who's already pre-ordered the book so far. And here's to helping the book get out there to everyone who needs it. Also, since I've had a number of people asking, there will be an audiobook and I will be narrating. Yes. So I'll share more info about that and how you can order the audiobook as soon as it's available. But it's basically going to be like one long, juicy, awesome podcast episode. So I'm really excited. And you can get your copy of the book delivered right to your door on its release date, possibly even a few days ahead, and help spread the anti-diet message by getting this book on more bestseller lists by going to christyharrison.com/book and pre-ordering now. That's christyharrison.com/book. Okay, and now without any further ado, let's go talk to Jeff Iovannone. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
So I think that there's never a time in my life where I didn't have a conflicted relationship with food, where I could just be, where I could just eat without overthinking things. So I grew up in Buffalo, New York in the 80s and had a fairly large Italian-American family. So food was a big part of family, socializing, identity. But at the same time, from a very young age, I was always aware that my body and that my weight were a problem. People always went out of their way to point that out to me. So there's this conflict, right, where food is about socializing and identity and celebration. Like my grandmother and my great aunts were fantastic cooks, but at the same time, I could never feel like I could wholly partake in that or simply enjoy that because there was a kind of always a problem. I actually have this very vivid memory of my mom being very angry when I went to, kindergarten and, you have to get weighed and all of that stuff. And her being very angry that I was like bigger than the other children. And that was like somehow an embarrassment on her. And so then when I, got into my teenage years, I ended up losing weight, both I think because of, just growing up in puberty, but I think also in part of engaging in some disordered eating and exercising. So, when I was leaving high school, entering college, I think my family finally started to back off in terms of, being on my back about my weight or my appearance. But then the next thing that I experienced was, coming out as gay in my early 20s. Then it was this kind of like whole other shift where suddenly like my weight and my appearance wasn't a problem with my family. And then, you come out, it's this big revelation about yourself. You're expecting, acceptance and a community. But then suddenly I was a problem in a different sense. And I think that there's a lot of this in the gay community. My experience is by no means unique, but I think you come out and you expect to have this community and this acceptance, and then suddenly it's you're too fat, you're too femme, you're too this, you're too that. You enter into another culture or subculture where there's this whole other set of standards that you have to contend with, right? So I kind of went from food being a problem because of the one context to kind of food being a problem in a different context. And I think that it's not until relatively recently that I've been able to unpack some of this and start to work beyond it, because I think diet culture and these messages that we get are so incredibly complex and insidious, and it's hard for us to recognize that they're not just the norm, that they're ideas that we're being sold and being marketed to. And I'm someone that has a degree in gender studies, and I think sometimes it's difficult for me to unpack these things. And I imagine it must be incredibly difficult for people that don't have the educational privilege and the training that I have.
Yeah, it is such a tangled ball of things because, like you said, it's so easy to just think, well, this is the way things are.
Right.
To not think of it as received cultural wisdom, but as just, well, this is life. This is how it is. And especially as a kid, I mean, it sounds like for you, it started so young, your family criticizing you about your weight. And did they put you on diets? Were they telling you to change the way you ate? Or was it sort of just this mixed message of like, you should eat, but also you're too fat?
Oh, yeah. So I remember particularly like over summer vacations, being told that I should use the summer vacation to lose weight because I was, starting to get to the age where the other kids at school would pick on me for being fat. And I actually remember, this is in retrospect kind of funny to me, but also not, my mom actually using this phrase and saying like, this summer it's going to be like Operation Starvation. You're going to lose some weight.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me when parents do that sort of thing. And I'm sure that they just thought they were doing what they needed to do. Parents are always just doing the best they can and coming from their own place of whatever their issues are. But it's fascinating that they were like, well, kids are going to start picking on you, therefore you need to lose weight, and actually enacting the very same thing. And I don't know if kids actually did pick on you or not, but like clearly they were stigmatizing you, even if the kids at school never did.
Right. And, I think most parents are kind of doing the best that they can. And that they don't want their child to suffer, right? So like what is the solution that they see? And, I also remember that my grandmother, who I was very close with, was always on some form of a diet. And I think that, from what I remember, she was like getting that from her doctor, right? So it's this idea of like her doing that because some sort of message connected to health, right? And then kind of that getting passed on to other people in the family.
That's interesting. So it kind of was coming in part from her and transmitted, diet culture was transmitted via her doctor to everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting, the parallels that you point out between that family environment and then this gay culture that you ended up in. Because like you said, it's like when you come out, you were expecting to be accepted, to sort of have things maybe get easier in a way, to find a community of like-minded people and then be like, woohoo, I found my people. And instead, it sounds like it was difficult in a similar way to how it was growing up with body stuff.
Right, going from kind of like one hierarchy and set of appearance standards to a different hierarchy and set of appearance standards.
Yeah, what was that like?
I think in a lot of ways, gay culture is actually worse than the dominant culture. The body standards and the ideals are even more intensified. And, I think that at the time, in my early 20s, or like when a lot of people are coming out and exploring gay culture, you're relatively young. And I think the age that people are coming out is getting even younger and younger as we have a more growing cultural awareness of LGBTQ issues. And I think at that age, you don't understand why there's these standards and kind of where they're coming from. And you want to fit in, you want to belong. So I think a lot of people give in to that pressure and want to be accepted, and so therefore see changing their physical appearance as an avenue to do that, to fit in, to be desirable, to be noticed. And I think for me at least, it hasn't been until much later that I feel like I actually had the knowledge and skill set to kind of unpack. It's hard to see, and a lot of people don't see it and end up just kind of replicating these incredibly damaging norms because they think that that's just the status quo. That's just how things are.
Right. And yeah, like we were talking about earlier too, it's you don't realize that is coming from somewhere, that these are cultural ideals that you are now internalizing. And then, yeah, you sort of enact them on yourself, self-stigmatize, which is really harmful.
And I actually, really started thinking about this because I was dating this guy that he was much more, extroverted than me. He was like very much a bar person. And I said to him at one point, I feel like I just don't like fit into gay culture. I like don't fit in with your friends. Like, I don't know what it is. And like, without missing a beat, he was like, oh, well, it's because you're not like fat, but you're like gay fat.
Ugh.
And maybe if you like lost some weight and went to the gym, you'd feel a lot better about yourself. And then you would also fit in.
Oh my God.
And so that was like incredibly damaging in the moment. But that me being the scholar that I am, I wanted to like understand what that meant in terms of like, what does it mean to be like gay fat, right? So, and I think it points to the fact that gay male culture has this different, more restrictive set of body standards than Western culture in general, and that those standards just don't come out of nowhere. They have a historical context and they exist for purpose. I think it's been very hard for me to not have a lot of anger towards other gay men, people that have made similar comments, right? And so this guy wasn't the only one. On multiple occasions, right, there were other people who kind of like went out of their way to point out to me that, oh, if I just lost some weight or I just changed the way that I looked, I would fit in so much better. I would be so much more desirable. But, I think really when we think about it, it's not just coming from gay men themselves. It's very much a reaction to heteronormativity and homophobia. And what the body standard is, as we look at how it changes over time in gay male culture, is always kind of a response to what are the oppressive external circumstances, right? So like historically, we're talking about a culture that is, very male-centered, very focused on masculinity. We define masculinity through kind of sexual power, sexual agency. So of course, there's very much a focus on sexuality, very much a focus on the body. If we look at like the late 19th to the early 20th century, when we start to see kind of like the rise of bodybuilding in these physique magazines, a big audience for those were actually gay men, because it was a legitimate way that they could look at semi-naked pictures of other men who were very physically fit. And of course, at the time, there's also anti-obscenity laws where you can't send obscene material through the mail, but this was okay. And then when we get to the 1970s, right, so the gay liberation period, it's not the kind of toned gym aesthetic that is the predominant aesthetic today. It was a thin aesthetic, but it wasn't the super muscular aesthetic. It was more of this beat counterculture, hippie, new left man kind of aesthetic. Then progressing in the 1970s, the mass gay liberation movement that emerges in the post-Stonewall era, Stonewall and riots of 1969, and gay culture is more visible. It starts to become more enmeshed with consumer capitalism. So we start to see the rise of bathhouses and porno theaters and bars. And so all of these kind of commercialized spaces catering towards gay men and gay male sexuality, we kind of start to have this more masculine, muscular aesthetic.
It's where like the mustaches come from, right? That's that era.
Yes, yeah, the Castro clone.
Mm-hmm.
That developed in the Castro district in San Francisco. So it's kind of like the muscular man with the mustache, this very working class aesthetic, wore flannel shirts. Levi's was kind of modeled after the Marlboro Man from the Marlboro cigarette ads that debuts in 1954. So this muscular aesthetic, but it was kind of a more masculine, rugged aesthetic. Then when we get to the early 1980s, and I think that this is a really key time in terms of the body aesthetic that develops, the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And we see a shift in what the aesthetic is. So it moves from that Castro clone aesthetic to this very white, slim, toned, hairless, clean-shaven aesthetic. And it makes total sense. AIDS, before we get the AIDS acronym in 1982, it was actually called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency. So it's seen as a gay disease, or it was also described as a gay cancer. So we have a population that's sexually stigmatized, and now they're also considered diseased. So the body aesthetic, right, is a reaction to that, wanting to seem, clean and healthy and kind of project manage this stigma, right, that's associated with gay identity at the time. And it's this dual stigma, right, both because of deviant sexuality and because of disease. And so that's when kind of the muscular gym look really ramps up into high gear. And doctors were actually prescribing steroids to gay men who had AIDS to prevent wasting, which is one of the side effects. And the journalist, Michelangelo Signorile, in one of his books, I believe Life on the Outside, where he's looking at this phenomenon, made this really interesting observation that at this time, the most kind of beautiful muscular men were actually the ones that were the most kind of sick and dying. But they were kind of cultivating this aesthetic to kind of manage their shame surrounding having AIDS. Mm-hmm. And so I really think that, and so I'm born in 1982, the year that the AIDS acronym is coined by the CDC. So I'm growing up in a world where, right, AIDS is present, but by the time I'm coming of age, it isn't as much of an issue, right? There's already effective treatment. And so I think for, myself and gay and queer men that are younger, we've very much grown up in a world where we've inherited this body aesthetic. And I think it's very much about mitigating shame and stigma, right? And this is also where diet culture comes in, because the roots of diet culture are very much connected to these ideas that appetite and food are connected to morality. And if we can control our appetite, we can control our food intake. It shows that we are a moral and good person. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's part of what's going on here, that if society is telling you that you're deviant and your sexuality is excessive and you don't have control, showing that you have control over your body and disciplining your body into a certain normative ideal standard is a way of showing that you are a good moral person that has control. And it's also projecting this desirable aesthetic is another way to mitigate shame and stigma.
It's so interesting too, the way that intersects with the idea of looking healthy, quote unquote.
Yes.
I mean, so fascinating that this look was actually something that was cultivated by men who were sick with AIDS before there were treatments, and that was then adopted and sort of held up as the standard of health or well-being. And also, like you said, that the sort of, showing that you have control over this part of your life. But I think it's interesting in modern culture, how the health piece is really brought to the fore too, when people talk about fitness, like you said in one of your pieces that I really loved reading, fitness journey, people call their fitness journey, right? And take gym selfies and publicly sort of perform that they're working out and that they're taking, quote unquote, taking care of their health. And that aesthetic developed from these roots, I think most people aren't even aware of in gay culture or in mainstream culture.
Right. And so the fitness journey, which I think is just a masculine word for a diet, is very much about publicly demonstrating, right? Because you can't just go on the fitness journey. You have to publicly document that you're on the fitness journey as a way to perform and kind of demonstrate that you're this, good, moral gay man. I think this also intersects with what you call the wellness diet and ideas about clean eating, because it's, again, this equation that, okay, if you're eating things that are considered clean, by extension, you're considered clean. And if you're eating things that are bad or dirty, right, you're bad or dirty. So I think, it connects to heteronormativity and homophobia. It's a way to show that you are a good, clean, moral person, right? That it's this idea you're just like everyone else aside from who you're attracted to. And I think there's so much going on in terms of language, right? How gay men don't talk about dieting, but they talk about their fitness journey or gymming or meal prepping, that masculinity is really antithetical to dieting, right? Because men in our culture are often told that they can be anything, they can do anything, but diets are about controlling and restricting, right? So it's at odds with the way that we define masculinity.
And it's so often packaged and sold to women too, or feminine people. It's sort of this is what you do if you're feminine. You try to shrink your body. So I think, that cultural inundation of oh, well, that's moms go on diets. That's not something that dads do.
Right. And gay men are already stigmatized for being feminine. So there is incentive to not recognize the extent to which gay male culture and diet culture are intertwined, that there's actually a lot of sexual and social privilege by conforming to certain ideas about masculinity. And right, so engaging in diet and exercise to achieve a more masculine ideal normative look, but then at the same time having to reject the fact that that's kind of a feminizing, right, practice, that diets are associated with women, that it's about control, that it's about restriction as a way of managing gay shame.
That's so interesting. You're right, that you can sort of dial down any other aspects of your identity that might go against the mainstream or the mythic norm, as Audre Lorde called it. If there's anything else about you other than being gay that doesn't fit within that box of white, cis, heteronormativity, thinness, whatever, that you can, at least with body size, like sand down those edges by shrinking your body. And that can give you additional privilege in the world. I mean, you had a really great piece that you wrote about Pete Buttigieg and why he's not the gay candidate that you want. And I'm thinking of that, and thinking about this, how like his being gay, he sort of frames as this like just sort of incidental thing about his identity. Like it's no big deal. And I mean, there's this contradiction because he sometimes makes it out to be like, this is really important. But for the most part, he's like, yeah, whatever. I'm gay, but I'm just like everyone else. I'm just like, and I went to Harvard and I served in the military and, all this stuff that sort of puts him more in that mythic norm box. And the being gay part just can sort of get swept to the side.
Right. And, and I think after, when we're getting into the 90s, right, and we start having effective treatment for HIV, the gay community is becoming even more mainstream, and it's very much about wanting to assimilate into mainstream American culture, right? Gay people are just like everyone else. The big issues at that time, right, are marriage equality, hate crime legislation, workplace protection, overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so allowing gay people to openly serve in the military, are all the issues that are kind of coming to the forefront. So there's powerful forces both in the dominant culture and within gay culture that are resulting in people being rewarded for wanting to conform. One of the other things I was thinking about is you recently had Sabrina Strings on the podcast talking about, I think we need to also talk about race and whiteness a little bit here. And I think the arguments that she's making, even though she's primarily focused on women and diet culture, right, so that it's also about racism and fear of the Black body, right? Dieting is about this fear of the Black body, which is associated with excess, and in particular, sexual excess. If we look at the normative gay male ideal, right, it's always a white ideal. So we see this kind of rejection, in particular, of gay Black men, because I think, again, there's this longstanding historical association between Blackness and sexual excess, right? And so in terms of the ideal body type, there needs to be kind of a pushing away of that in terms of both desirability and representation to, again, present this kind of normative, controlled, easily assimilatable figure.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such an important point, that what you call the normate gay, right, is
Yes.
like this white, thin, non-feminine man. And that, so much of that, I mean, it's so interesting, those intersections of diet culture and sort of where it came from. And just thinking about what I talked about with Sabrina Strings about the history of diet culture and anti-Blackness, and also what I go into in my book about the history of diet culture, and talked about with Emily Contois on the podcast as well. Like, it really seems to all come back to this American Industrial Revolution period in history where a lot of these ideas got sort of fixed. And this idea about wanting to push away Blackness or disassociate oneself from people of color through thinness and through dieting emerged at that time. But then also this idea of bodybuilding and gay men, like it planted the seed of that aesthetic even at that time, where this idea of masculinity and muscularity started to be associated.
Right. And, I think you brought up the term that I used, the normate gay. I think it's important to use that term because within gay culture, there's all of this other terminology to kind of describe people who are not the aesthetic ideal. So there's, bears and twinks and etc. But the ideal, right? The white, slim tone, but not too muscular, not too masculine, not too feminine, able-bodied, cisgender gay man. There's not a label for that, right? So I thought it was important to give it a name, to recognize the fact that it's not just a natural ideal, it's a cultural construction. And it's also a cultural construction that, yes, people can embody that to a large extent, but it's also, I think, impossible to completely conform to that kind of package of aesthetic ideals. And that's the point, right? Diet culture and consumer capitalism are supposed to keep us in lack and want in pursuit of this idealized image that is humanly impossible for us to reach. And I can't take complete credit for the term normate. It actually comes from a feminist disability scholar named Rosemary Garland Thompson, and she was on my dissertation committee. But in her book, it's called Extraordinary Bodies, she comes up with this term normate as a way to kind of look at how disability, physical disability in particular, is not just this medically evident category or identity, but it's also socially produced because we have this idea of what the body should be or what it should be able to do. And then anyone that falls short of that falls into this category of disability, right? Gets this special label. So she creates this counter label, the normate. So people who are able-bodied, who kind of fit into the average body ideal, ability, aesthetic, that the body of the physically disabled person is defined against. So I think, Ray, there's a similar thing going on in gay male culture, that there's kind of this normative aesthetic ideal, and then kind of everyone that falls short of that gets some sort of other label that within gay male culture, and I think the culture at large, results in them having less privilege and less social and sexual capital.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And I think it is so important to just name that too, right? To give a name to this false ideal that's been culturally constructed, because again, we have to become aware that this is not just how things are. This is not just the way things are quote unquote supposed to be. This is a myth that has been created in order to sell people things, in order to keep some people oppressed, arguably maybe to keep everyone oppressed in the gay community, just like it keeps everyone oppressed to be chasing after some false ideal of whatever gender you identify as. It keeps everyone oppressed to be chasing after some false ideal of able-bodiedness that the vast majority of people actually don't fully reach. And certainly throughout our lives, we all go through varying degrees of disability as well. So it's interesting to think about that it is just a cultural construction, and the uses of that cultural construction can be really nefarious.
Right. And I think despite a lot of, the recent gains, and we're talking during Pride Month and there's Pride stuff everywhere, but we are in a period of backlash in terms of rights for the LGBTQ community, both globally, but particularly with the Trump administration. So here we are within gay male culture in particular, so focused on these ideals and these norms, and sometimes like tearing each other apart, as opposed to coming together to actually work for change, work towards a common goal. Right? It functions to keep us divided, which I think why it's so important that we need to recognize the extent to which mainstream gay male culture and diet culture are enmeshed. And in fact, I would go so far to say that they're almost one and the same. And I think that, that might sound extreme to some people, but I think we have to name the problem for what it is and to show how insidious it is. And, not only does it really harm people's lives on an individual level, but it also has these larger systemic implications in terms of our ability to work together as a community for change and liberation.
Yeah, that's such an important point. It functions as a wedge to keep the gay community from coming together around these issues of liberation. And I think it's also so insidious because people can think of it as, well, this is just what I desire. My desire is for someone who looks like this, right? And I'd be curious to talk with you a little bit about the politics of desire. And, you talk about how desire is political. For someone who's like, well, I don't know, I just prefer this. What would you say? How would you explain that?
So I would say that our preferences are never just inherent or personal. They're always political because we exist in a social context. So our desires don't exist independently of that context. So, well, to a certain extent, we might have innate preferences and we can't, right at the drop of a hat, just change that. We can think critically about where that's coming from, right? And so, like, why is it that, I like people that are smaller bodied as opposed to larger body, or why do I like white people but I'm not attracted to people of color, right? Whatever it is. And when we kind of start unpacking the roots of that, right, and do our desires and preferences align with, right, who is considered superior or inferior, when we start to look at these larger systems of advantage and disadvantage, and we think through that, right, then does our preference, which we might originally think of as innate, does it start to shift, right? When we unpack, why is it that this might be desirable to me, but that isn't? Is it because that's how you really innately feel, or because that's what you've been told?
It is so fascinating to think through that. And I feel like that, I think in my younger days when I was sort of spinning apart, questioning everything and having a lot of anxiety about stuff, I feel like those kinds of questions could have made me feel torn apart. And I think it might be worth it to just acknowledge, for people who are in that place, maybe this isn't the work you need to be doing right now. If you're in a place of questioning everything in your life and not feeling like you have a ground underneath you, then finding that ground is probably important. But I feel like these conversations, to me now, like where I'm at in my life now, I find so fascinating to think through that and feel equipped to be able to do that work and think more critically about what I've been conditioned to desire, at this point in life. So
Right.
I think it's maybe also an issue of where we're at in our life, that can we even do that work?
Yeah, and you have to be at the right place, I think, and you also have to have the tools, and people aren't often given the tools to do that. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in my work, is to give people some terms and concepts and context to be able to start thinking through some of the stuff. Because I think in particular for gay men, so there were two sociologists, Pyle and Klein, who actually made the argument in their work that the body issues that gay men deal with, right, are on the same level as heterosexual women, that both groups kind of face similar pressures, but yet at the same time, we have no gay men's body liberation movement that exists to the extent that one does within contemporary feminism, or as like a subset of contemporary feminism. And there's so many people that are doing this work from a feminist context. Yourself, Lindy West, Jamila Jamil, Virgie Tovar. But if we think of gay men who are doing this work, like maybe I can point to a couple people, maybe Jonathan Van Ness, maybe Elliot Glazer. And I think that part of the reason why that is there's very powerful incentives in place to keep gay men from recognizing the extent to which they're engaged in diet culture. And I think it's all about norms of masculinity, in particular gay masculinity. we talk a lot about the concept of toxic masculinity. So these aspects of masculinity that have socially harmful or regressive effects, but it's often framed as a phenomenon that's solely related to straight men. And I was actually laughing as I was grading one of my students' projects. She wrote this really great analysis of, it was a cross-cultural analysis of toxic masculinity. And she was talking about China. And the term that they use in Chinese for toxic masculinity, if you translated it literally into English, it translates as straight male cancer.
Yeah.
Right. So, but it's speaking to how we think that this is a phenomenon relating to only straight men. But I also think that there's something that we could call a toxic gay masculinity. So aspects of gay masculinity that are similarly harmful or regressive, right? So we can have this context where at the same time, gay men are victimized by the dominant toxic masculinity, by heterosexual men, but then gay men themselves can victimize other marginalized men. And so, and I think a lot of toxic gay masculinity is wanting to kind of conform to this normate gay ideal. So wanting to conform to this body aesthetic, whiteness, being cisgender, being able-bodied, and then kind of oppressing other gay men or marginalized men that kind of fall outside of what the gay masculine ideal is. And so I think we need to recognize this more, because we need to have more role models. We need to have people who are speaking out about this. We need to have a movement, I think, around these issues. And I think sometimes it's easy for us to just falsely assume that white cisgender gay men in particular aren't that oppressed anymore. But if we actually look at the data, that's not the case at all. So gay men very much suffered with disordered eating, full-blown eating disorders, suicide, loneliness, low self-esteem, other mental health issues. And I think it also starts really young as well. And so I think we need more analysis, more representation, more role models around these issues. I know that it helps me if I think cultivating that sense of empathy and connectedness. Jonathan Van Ness from Queer Eye has been just the fact that he exists in the world is this very outspoken femme gay man who, yes, I think he would fall within our cultural parameters of thinness, but doesn't conform to this ideal gym aesthetic, and is very, I think, vocal about that, really puts himself out there. When people do that, that's so helpful. There's been so many times where I've been having a bad day or have felt, down on myself, or, been feeling like I'm, not good enough, or doing this work is impossible. And then I look at something, that he posted where he's like dancing in his kitchen or something like that, and being very vulnerable. And then it just creates this moment of connection, right? Where, it's not just me, I'm not alone. And there's other people that are doing this work too. I think we need so much more of that.
Oh God, we really do. And I love that you're out there doing this work. And I'm curious too about your own relationship with your body and how that's shifted as you've done this work. And also even your history, your career trajectory with it, because you have a degree in gender studies, you said, but how did you sort of get from there to this particular niche in looking at gay men's relationship with their bodies? How did that unfold?
It was always coming from, a very personal place. And I actually think for a lot of scholars and academics that's often the case, but we're trained not to say that, right? Because we're supposed to be rational and intellectual, and we're not supposed to be personal or emotional, right? So it didn't start as something that I wanted to study for or purely intellectual reasons. It was because it was coming so much from my direct experience, and it was really impacting me, and me needing to take some of the skill set that I had to kind of understand and unpack that. And it's taken a really long time. And for me, it has always kind of centered around dating or kind of liking people, and that like triggering, right, these feelings of I wasn't good enough. I needed to change myself. And there was, so many times where I would be interested in someone and I would get very much into this mindset of, okay, well, I have to do everything that I can to like make this other person like me. And that would often, involve thinking that I needed to lose weight or to change my appearance. And I got to the point where it was like I just couldn't do it anymore. I remember there was a particular time where there was a guy I really liked, and then I had ended up like losing a ton of weight and things didn't work out. And then a friend said to me, well, did you, really think that this guy was going to like you? Because you're just kind of like average.
Oh.
And
oh my God. Some friend. Ugh.
And that was just devastating because I was like, oh my God, I'm like literally killing myself trying to look better. And then that's still not good enough, right? Because it's often not just about size within gay male culture, but it's about aesthetic. So I think that, there's kind of in tandem, there's like sizeism going on and lookism, right? So we give privilege to people that are a certain body size or shape, and then there's lookism that we privilege people who have this certain package of aesthetic characteristics. And I actually like ended up confronting that friend about that, and we actually don't talk anymore. That kind of ended things. But that was just like really, I was like, I kind of can't do this anymore. And then recently, this is like within the past like 6 months, I had met this other guy that I really, really liked. And I was having like, it was like those feelings kind of coming up again, right? That I'm not good enough. I need to lose weight. I need to change the way I look. So I was like really, going through it. And I remember finding seeing Megan Jane Crabb's book, Body Positive Power, at Barnes & Noble, and reading the book and reading her definition of what a diet is, and just like having this revelation that like, oh my gosh, like for the majority of my life, I had basically like been on a diet and was doing what you call the wellness diet and rationalizing it and just saying, oh, I'm eating clean and I'm being healthy. And it almost became a superiority thing for me, right? Where I could say in my head, well, like, I don't look like this person, or I don't look as good as this person, but I know I'm probably like eating better than they are, right? So like as a way to like make myself feel better. And that's actually how I discovered you and your podcast, because I was reading Body Positive Power, and then said to one of my friends who's a social worker who works around these issues, like, I read this book and I realized like, oh my gosh, like for the majority of my life, I've been on a diet. And she was like, you need Christy Harrison.
Aw. Oh, that's amazing.
So I got to the point where I just could not do it anymore. It wasn't working, and feeling like I really needed to start analyzing these things, speaking out, stepping into a position of leadership, right? And as I've already said, looking for other kind of role models or other gay or queer men that were doing this work and not really finding that. And so I was like, okay, maybe I need to be that person.
Oh, that's amazing. I think it's so powerful to step into that role and to say, I'm going to be that person, even when you're still figuring it out yourself, because you saw that needed to be in the world. And I'm sure there are gay men listening to this and people of all stripes listening to this who are inspired by what you're saying and are going to do the work, come on board with this maybe new gay men's liberation movement that you're starting. So I think that's huge. Gay men's body liberation movement, I should say.
And it's not easy, but we have to do it. And I've gotten a lot of resistance in terms of, because I think people don't want to confront, the fact that gay men in particular don't want to kind of confront the fact that maybe they're on a diet, they're engaged in diet culture and they haven't recognized it, that they're actually benefiting from, right, some of these body ideals. Or people have said, like, I'm being divisive and, why can't I just get along, and that the community is already oppressed. There's all these issues. But rate oppression just doesn't happen in one kind of singular, uniform way, right? There's the larger system of homophobia, but then there's this hierarchy within the culture as well that we need to work to uproot.
And like calling out oppression is not itself oppression too. I think that's important. It's like,
right.
like I think people can feel defensive, of course. And I mean, I was there myself. Like 10 years ago, a friend of mine told me about health at every size. And I was just like, I am not hearing this,
Right.
And now here I am 10 years later singing it from the rooftops. So I get the transition that has to happen in order to get to that place. But yeah, I feel like people's sort of knee-jerk defensiveness of like, you're being oppressive is really frustrating sometimes, because it's like, no, this is actually calling out something that is actively oppressing you and you're
Right.
twisting it.
And I think we often take the critique personally, like we are being told that we're bad people or that we're doing this, when in fact, I think it's really about looking at the larger systems, that we as individuals are just kind of products of that.
Right. And looking at the way that the system has shaped you and looking at the system as problematic, I think inevitably at some point often moves individuals to action, moves us to say, okay, I'm going to question my own participation in this system. But I think it doesn't have to at first, and I think there's oftentimes a really necessary place of like sitting with it and saying like, oh, I'm starting to see the problems with this system, but I don't want to give up my participation in it yet. And I'm still going to do these things, and having to like sit with that cognitive dissonance. And that's okay. Like that's a part of change too, I think.
Absolutely, because I think it's hard to, if you've been like benefiting from it, right, and then you're tying your sense of self-worth and your identity to that, it can be really hard to give that up. But I think when we start, looking at it, right, looking at the extent to which gay male culture and diet culture are so intertwined, it becomes really painfully obvious. I think, one example of that is, so it's Pride Month right now. And so there's a lot of marketing that goes on towards the LGBTQ community, right? So this concept of rainbow capitalism. So integrating or taking the LGBTQ community or LGBTQ activism and putting that into corporate marketing campaigns, right? Marketing towards the LGBTQ community as a way to make a profit. And of course, those marketing campaigns are often aimed at the members of the community that have the most privilege. So white, middle class, cisgender gay men and lesbians who have the purchasing power. So I think one of the things that we see, in addition to rainbow sneakers and rainbow mouthwash, slap a rainbow on everything, is diets being marketed towards gay men, specifically for Pride Month. One of my friends sent me this post on Instagram from a personal trainer who was advertising to gay men, basically saying, I'll help you get your pride body for Pride Month. And basically what that is getting the normate gay body. And so it's this idea, in order to be able to legitimately participate in this space or these celebrations, that you have to look a certain way to be acceptable. And I think that's completely antithetical to the history and the spirit of Pride. It should really be come as you are. And an acquaintance of mine was actually like, oh yeah, for Pride Month, I'm doing this, really popular diet that I'm not going to name, because if I could get my body to look a certain way, I can make a lot of tips bartending just during Pride and like pay my rent for several months. So we, literally have this idea that within gay male culture, certain bodies are monetarily, tangibly worth more. And, I think if we think about the fact that Pride is coming out of, in part, the Stonewall Inn riots of 1969. It was a riot. It was a rebellion. It was an uprising. It was about revolution. It was about challenging the status quo. That's completely not what it's become. And I think it's so important that we remember those roots, and that it shouldn't be about looking a certain way in order to be legitimately in that space or legitimately LGBTQ. What is that saying? Like a swimsuit body is anybody that's wearing a swimsuit, right? I think we could say like a pride body is, any body that you have pride in, or right, if you have pride in your body, you like who you are, then you have a pride body.
Yes. Oh my God, so important and so sad, just really depressing how the roots of the movement and the roots of pride got so twisted in this way, to where people are now, pride is contingent on having a particular type of body, instead of pride is something that you inherently deserve. And that's what this whole movement was about. And the Stonewall riots happened like 50 years ago, right? It's the 50-year anniversary. Yeah. So like in 50 years, how far this movement has sort of been pulled by capitalism into this, and by diet culture in this direction.
Right. And I march in the Pride Parade here in Buffalo with our senior group here, Rainbow Seniors Visible and Proud, RSVP. So they asked myself and other members of our local LGBTQ history group to march with them, right? Because we couldn't study LGBTQ history unless our elders made it first. And I was just astounded by the fact how many companies and corporations were marching in this parade. And we were relatively up towards the front of the parade, honoring our elders because of Stonewall 50. But the bank that's the corporate sponsor of the parade had 500 employees marching in front of our LGBTQ seniors. And I'm really worried that we're going to get to a place where basically we don't have control of our identity anymore, that it's just being packaged and sold to us by corporations, that we're not, able to define anymore what it means to be LGBTQ, at least not in the mainstream. And I think part of that is diet culture and is certain aesthetics and ideals, and that's kind of it's part of this corporate takeover of pride, right? And so I've made the argument that diet culture and gay male culture are enmeshed. I think that they're even more enmeshed within the space of pride celebrations and the consumer capitalism that takes place specifically around these events during the month of June.
What can be done about that? Like, what do you think needs to happen in order for pride to become more, again, what it was at its roots?
So I think that it's probably unrealistic that we're just going to completely dismantle corporate pride, right? Like sometimes, as my friend Carol, who's a longtime gay rights activist, said, sometimes you can't just remodel the house. You have to build a new house. And I think that to an extent, right, people should be allowed to have fun and celebrate. And so I don't think we're going to be able to completely dismantle corporate pride. What I think we can do, though, is engage in parallel organizing and create something else that's more in the original spirit of what pride was in the 1970s, that also kind of functions as a way to hold corporate pride celebrations accountable in terms of, some of the more egregious actions that they might be engaging in, right? So our corporations that are actively doing things that are harming the LGBTQ community, or their marginalized populations, right? Are they corporate sponsors of pride, right? Is kind of pride accessible. But I think we can, start to build these parallel structures. And I think it's, Philadelphia that has started doing this kind of parallel Pride for the People. So I think we can do something like that that's an alternative for the people that don't want to participate in the corporate sponsored Pride, that focuses more on community and education and workshops and speakers. Like if you look at what different gay rights groups in the 1970s were doing in terms of Pride, which I think, even though it might not have been as visible, like in Buffalo, we don't get an actual parade until the early 90s. But I think what people were doing in the 70s was actually more radical, because it was about education and change and activism and bringing the community together, and art and theater. So I think while we can't completely dismantle the corporate Pride, we can build something else, and we can hold that corporate Pride accountable.
Yeah, it sounds like that would really help the gay men's body liberation movement that you're talking about too, could really fit nicely into that, to bring in education and awareness around diet culture and how that is so enmeshed in the gay male community.
Right, and create a space for kind of people that might not feel comfortable in some of these mainstream Pride spaces, where you might be judged or you might not feel comfortable if you don't look a certain way.
Right, where the messaging is about you have to have the Pride body and you're going to get paid if you do. Creating an alternative space where it's the explicit message is come as you are and all bodies are welcome here would be so radical.
Yes. Yeah, because Pride is a human and civil right.
Yes. I feel like that's a great note to end on. And I also feel like I have to run this episode during Pride Month. So I'm going to make that happen. So important. Thank you so much for everything you shared. This is really wonderful. And can you tell us where people can find you online and learn more about your work?
Sure. People can find me on Medium, and I'm at Jeffrey, Jeffry, period, Iovannone, Iovannone. And I write a column for a publication on Medium that's called Think Queerly. It's th-ink queerly. And that's typically the place where I talk about body liberation issues. So kind of please come and find me there, right? And so in the, spirit of Stonewall, let's riot, not diet.
Yes, I love it. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much, Christy.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Jeff Iovannone for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path for yourself, you can grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten some value out of this show, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. And while you're at it, if you like the podcast, please leave us a nice rating and review to help other people discover the show and to help brighten my day and make it feel good to be doing this work. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, you can go to christyharrison.com/200. That's christyharrison.com/200. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode of Food Psych was brought to you by my forthcoming book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. Learn more and pre-order now at christyharrison.com/book. That's christyharrison.com/book. A big thanks to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Kimmy Singh, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show for you every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.